the old-time realtors would say to me, well, might as well close up shop because we're not going to make it. And there's always a way.
"40 Years of the Business Journal" is sponsored by Compco and these participating sponsors.
Can you talk about what was the environment like at that time? We're talking about the period. You're still
early
very
80s.
much, early 80s. You're in the period very much in the immediate aftermath of the steel mill closings, the Mahoning Valley. The Mahoning Valley is still trying to adjust to that. What was the environment like back then?
Well, when you opened your office, we were still in a problem with finances because the rates were about, I would say they were backing off a little bit because they were the highest they were in 1982. And I would say we were looking at 11 and a half interest rates back in that time, and that really struggled. And of course, a lot of my competitors would say, well, we might as well close up and move. When Sheet and Tube closed, everybody said, close the doors, we're going to move on. Same thing when the interest rates went up in the early 80s. I can remember talking to Chuck Schellog, who was president of First Federal back then, and Chuck told me that they would never, ever have fixed rate mortgages ever again. They were just going to have adjustables, 1 and 3 year adjustables, because you could get let's say a couple of percentage points less on your rate if you took an adjustable. Then it would increase every year if it was 1 year, and every 3 years if it was a 3 year. And that's pretty much what we were dealing with. Now, during that time, it started to back away, but we did a lot, in the early 80s, we did a lot of land contracts. Probably 30 to 35% of our business was land contracts. I haven't had a land contract in 20 years now. So that's how much different it was. And I would have to say the early 80s, the big difference between the early 80s and now is sellers had equity, which they were allowed to do a land contract because they had equity. They'd take some of their equity out, get a down payment from the buyer. And the reason that was because buyers had down payments. Now, the down payment is not as high as it used to be. A lot more insured loans than there were back then. And that probably marks the biggest difference. We started seeing some of these companies that were startups in the early 80s. I mean, we managed to get through every problem, but as soon as there was one problem, there seemed to be another problem. And then right about that time, East Ohio Gas and Columbia Gas shut off the gas. So we weren't building any houses. And I would say that was about I don't know exactly the dates, but I know that it was early 80s to like about 87, we didn't have any gas hookups. So they were doing oil and electric furnaces were not, they were not perfected back then. So the electric furnaces gave way to heat pumps and then to baseboard heating. But there were developments. There was one development in Poland where they built every single house in there with oil heat, with a tank buried in the ground. So obviously, in the 90s, when the gas came back, they had a change, and they changed them all to gas. But then there were all these tanks in the ground, and people had, you don't have to register a tank if it's residential. But people would say, well, what if there's oil in there? What if there's something going on in that? So that all the time when the Business Journal started, that was what we were contending with.
Would you say that was the biggest challenge that you faced back then, or what are some of the main challenges?
Between the interest rates and the gas being shut off. We still build houses, but our housing stock was down probably 60%. We lost a lot of builders during that time period, not as many as we did in 2008, 2009, but we lost quite a few in the combination of those things. And I used to have, the old-time realtors would say to me, well, might as well close up shop because we're not going to make it. And there's always a way. And so
let's talk about that. How did you cope with those challenges?
We worked a lot of land contracts. And those land contracts were 2 to 3 years. But what I found that was interesting is those people that bought those houses in the early 80s and the seller could not offer a land contract, those people tended to pay less for the house because they financed it. You know, the buyer that came in and the seller was willing to give them their interest rates, you know, they might have had a 7% interest rate, and if they went out for new financing, they would have 11 or 12. So those people that had the 11 or 12, I noticed the sellers were backing off on their price. So those people actually benefited because in the early 80s, those rates were high, but then as the 80s went on, I could bet there were probably those people that bought in the early 80s refinanced 2 to 3 to 4 times because the rates kept going down. A boon to the financial business, a boom to title companies because they were redoing all their loans. And that happened over a series of probably 5 to 6 years. That thing changed. And but I recall the lenders came back with the fixed rate mortgage as we got later in that decade. I worked with a builder named Bob Tabacca, and he did custom homes. And we never probably had any problem selling his homes because he sold them in the $180,000 to $200,000 price range, which was a high range. But those people that were attracted to that, financing wasn't a problem. But so we were building, probably. He was building 3 to 4 houses a year, and every time we got them up, they were sold because there wasn't any competition, and people wanted new houses. And construction wasn't too expensive compared to what it is today. You know, the price per foot was affordable to the average buyer. The interest rate was the problem.
What was cost per foot to construct back then? Ballpark.
That's hard to remember.
Okay.
I would hesitate, but you know, you're talking about a house that was sold for $180 that's going for $450 now. You know, that's so you calculate it out, including the lots were, you know, $30,000. Now they're $80,000 and $90,000. Of course, if it's Westford, they're $120,000.
What are some of the other big changes? How has the real estate market, changed locally in the years since the early mid '80s? Well,
I see now what big thing happened in the '90s, because 87 to 88 was the time when the gas came back, so we started getting a good response on new construction. We were doing. I worked with a lot of builders. We were doing. In the 90s, we were doing Rosewood in Canfield. We did the Reserve in Boardman. I'm trying to think, quite a few. Then we were doing a development in Poland with Bob Tabacca. So there's a lot of new construction going on during that time period.
Would the tech boom have been around that time, or am I not? Or am I putting it too early? And would it even have been much of a factor here?
The tech boom really started taking effect in around 2000, because I can remember putting computers at our front desk because my agents were demanding them, because we had a lot of incoming calls. So we had 2 sales desks at the front, and in 2001 I put 2 computers up front because the agents demanded to have those because they needed them. So that's the first time. And when we had the change in we changed in the 2000s, I never had a computer at my desk until about 2005 or 6, and I can remember the agent saying, as we go into the new millennium, is John Burgan going to be able to keep up with the tech? And I said, boy, I don't know, but I can call across the hall to Donna. Donna's still here. I can call across, and she'll save my butt for something I don't know. And that's true. When I went from brokerage to sales, I had to do a lot. I had to be a lot more competent on the computer. But that 2000 range was when we started, and then as it grew, in 2001, 2003, 2005, each year it got more tech.
How is the beyond real estate? How do you think the Mahoning Valley itself has changed, but whether for good or ill?
Well, the biggest thing that I don't think people paid attention to was as the suburbs grew, people weren't paying attention to where those people were coming from. They were coming from the city. I've worked in a declining market for my whole career. The market's going down maybe 1%, and so all these, since I've been in business since '72, I saw all the growth in the suburbs. And then as that happened, all those houses were suddenly, 8,000 houses were vacant in the city. And people, it's a crisis. Well, it was going on for a long time.
Yeah.
And that's, I think now, and not a lot was done about it back then. And the one thing that I think they really jumped on the bandwagon, and I'm not sure exactly what mayor we had in Youngstown, but they finally worked on getting federal aid to start taking down those houses. And, it was the typical thing that all the major cities were going through. I grew up in Rochester, New York. Same thing, donut effect. The downtown was devastated. They had major businesses. Now,
Right, Xerox
and Kodak,
Yeah.
and Detroit was the same way. So Youngstown was no different. And I thought that back in the 80s, when we were losing our steel mills, Youngstown was on an island. They were like, we were like no one else. We had major problems and nobody else did, but we weren't paying that close attention. Steel mills were going down in a lot of other places. But in the early, when the steel mills were closing, that was one thing. But when the inner cities, people just weren't going downtown. They weren't living in the city as much. And again, there were some things why people lived in the cities before was because they were close to their work. And so people were more and more moving out. And I saw that between the 70s, 80s, and 90s, tremendous amount of growth. But then the population, when I came here, it was 170,000 people living in the city. In '89, I remember I had an agent working for me that used to be the head of, his name was Tom Crisply. He used to be a head of the Youngstown Education Association. He said they had 29,000 students in the Youngstown City schools back then. So that really changed. And so I think that's the biggest thing. And people started realizing, well, we got to take care of the city. And I think that the downtown, what is it called? The Mahoning County Corrections Association on Market Street?
Yeah, Community Corrections Association.
They did a tremendous job of maintaining Billick. Dr. Billick was in charge of that. He did a tremendous job of cleaning up the corridor from uptown down to the main city. And then I think a lot of the businesses that relocated to Boardman, started realizing, they left properties in the city, and I think a lot of times they were giving those to the land bank, or they were giving them to the Corrections Association so that they could get cleaned up.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of support there. I saw that support coming from, the early twos, for probably a 10-year period. More and more, every year, they were getting more involved. I think that really made a difference. They were between Ungaro and what was his?
McKelvey was just after.
McKelvey, and then the gentleman that went to Washington.
Jay Williams.
Jay Williams. They really worked. Like Jay Williams was really, he did a lot of work with us. I was working with Habitat for Humanity at the time, and we were building houses on the east side and on the south side, and he decided that he was going to get some federal funds for us to put garages in, because people would buy these houses and they wouldn't have a garage, so people knew when they were home and when they weren't home. And he was able to get us, probably we built 20 houses for Habitat, and Jay found the funds for garages. So it was just like we were working together to try to solve those issues. And then during that whole 2000 period, when you got to 2008, 2009, that's when the market fell out from under. And we went through a period of about probably 3 years, 3.5 years, 4 years. I remember my son was just in the business in 2009. And in 2011, we did a billboard for him and said, "This is the best market I've ever seen." Well, he didn't see the others.
Yeah.
But we've always bounced back. Youngstown's always bounced back from an issue. And if you think there's an issue now, there will be, or if you think you have good times now, there's always something that comes up. It is either local or it's global. And it does affect the market. Everything affects the market. So it's just the way it is.
What's ahead for the Mahoning Valley?
Well,
based on what you're seeing now.
I've always been an optimist, but I have certain trepidations, and I think we've got to come together, and I think we have come together as a city and as a community, and I think we're a bigger whole than we used to be. It used to be we are them and the city is somewhere else. So I really do think the communities come together. I think YSU has really done a tremendous job of building to the downtown. It's become that gap that used to be between Youngstown State and the downtown has kind of grown because, the gap hasn't grown, it's receded because they now have housing for students downtown, which I think is excellent. And since the commercial is down, the residential has gone up in the city. And I think that's made a big difference. I think we do need some grocery stores or some more retail in the downtown area. But I think the thing that I thought was most interesting is that residents in downtown Youngstown were complaining about the noise ordinance because there was a noise ordinance that at 10 o'clock things had to shut down.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, that was a positive for me because I thought, gee, they're having residences complaining, and at least we have people downtown late.
Would you have ever have anticipated a residential population downtown like we're seeing now, and is apparently growing?
I didn't see that, and I'd say the Convocation Center. I guess it was originally called the Convocation Center.
Youngstown Convocation Center.
When that came, when Trafficant was responsible for getting the funds for that, there were a lot of skepticism, but I think that's really proven to be very successful. And Eric Ryan has a lot to do with that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I remember the early years. It was bleeding red ink pretty regularly.
And they were going, it's the biggest mistake we ever made. And so,
but again, as you said, that was also before Eric Ryan came on board, I think.
They hired an outside company.
Yeah, I think they were based in Boston or something.
And they were part-time here, and they never really...
Yeah.
And Eric had so many connections because he started this, he started in Struthers, I think, and he was bringing in groups, and they got to trust him, and then he'll go, even Canfield Fairgrounds had to use Eric because Eric had many more, so I think that's made a big difference downtown. I think we'll thrive, we'll survive, we always do, we always come back. I wouldn't trade. I don't go to Florida in the wintertime because I like it being here. Whereas one thing that happened when I moved here in 1972, and people said, "Why would you move to Youngstown?" And that really hit me hard because I said, I visited here for many times, and I really liked it. I'm probably the only person I know of that moved to Youngstown to sell real estate. I didn't even know where Market Street was when I got here. But I noticed the people would say, "Well, why would you move here?" And I don't think they realize how nice they have it. So I said, well, maybe you should move somewhere else and then find out how good it is in Youngstown. But I used to go and talk to a lot of the schools, and that was from probably the 80s and the 90s more than any time. And I'd say to the kids, and I can remember one, I went to some elementary schools in the city. I would go to some schools in the suburbs. But when I would talk to high school students, I'd say to them, okay, let's compare Youngstown let's compare your school to a school in California. Let's try Hollywood High. And they had ACT, what did we have? SATs here and the ACTs there, so I did the comparison. About the same ACT. Hollywood High at the time, I can remember distinctly, they were 12,000, 13,000 per student. The schools here were 5,000 to 6,000 per student, and they were equal. And I said, okay, where do you want to live? And they told me all these places, and I said, okay, well, let's see, go back to California. At that time, 74% of the people in Youngstown owned their own homes, 35% in California. So you want to live in California? Why do you think that is true? Because more affordable.
Yeah.
This has always been a more affordable community than as long as I've been here. I came here from New York, and one of the things I said to people immediately when they said to me, why would you move to Youngstown? I said, well, first of all, my taxes are half what they were in New York State. And I said, that in itself, you people don't understand. You complain about taxes, they're nothing compared to what I had to pay, and I was only living in a $20,000 house. I said, really? Yeah. I said, well, there's a lot of advantages.
"40 Years of the Business Journal" is sponsored by Comco and these participating sponsors.